The siren's wail faded into the hum of distant traffic, leaving only the crisp, cool air of the early morning. I stepped out of the unmarked vehicle, the scent of damp earth and something metallic clinging to the suburban quiet. The address belonged to Alistair Finch, the visionary behind FinchTech, a name synonymous with innovation and, now, sudden death. The two-story smart home, all sharp angles and reflective surfaces, stood stark against the softening pre-dawn sky, its grandeur muted by the flashing red and blue lights. A uniformed officer nodded me through the perimeter. Inside, the air conditioning was a frigid whisper against my skin, a stark contrast to the unfolding tableau. The house was a temple to minimalist design and cutting-edge automation, but the workshop, located in a detached, soundproofed annex, was where the order truly fractured. "Morning, Thorne," a gruff voice greeted me. Detective Harding, a man whose face seemed perpetually etched with the weight of the world, gestured vaguely towards the center of the room. "Industrial accident. Looks pretty cut and dry." I offered a non-committal grunt, my eyes already sweeping the scene. The workshop was a marvel of precision engineering, custom-built workbenches, articulated robotic arms, 3D printers humming quietly in standby mode. But in the midst of this technological sanctuary lay the victim. Alistair Finch. His body was slumped against a large, custom-fabricated metal chassis, a complex piece of machinery that looked like a prototype for something impossibly advanced. He was still wearing a protective apron, heavy-duty gloves on his hands. A thick cable, its insulation visibly frayed and blackened, snaked from the chassis, across his chest, and then lay innocuously on the polished concrete floor. The air carried a faint, acrid tang of ozone and burnt plastic. "Initial assessment points to electrocution," Harding continued, his voice low. "Power surge, maybe." He was working on that new quantum processor prototype. High voltage, experimental stuff. Fire department confirmed no external power grid issues. Internal malfunction, most likely. I knelt, pulling on my examination gloves, the latex snapping against my wrists. My eyes were already drinking in the details, cataloging them, cross-referencing them against the vast library of scenarios stored in my mind. Finch's face was pale, almost waxy, with a faint blue tinge around the lips. His hair, usually meticulously styled, was singed in places. A dark, irregular burn mark marred the left side of his chest, directly beneath where the cable had rested. It was consistent with a high-voltage discharge. The scene screamed tragic accident, but something snagged. I leaned closer, my gaze fixed on Finch's hands. The heavy-duty gloves were still on, thick and insulated, designed to protect against exactly this kind of hazard. Yet, the burn on his chest was severe, suggesting direct contact. I traced the path of the freight cable, noting the scorch marks on the chassis, the melted plastic casing. All consistent. Then I saw it. On the back of Finch's right glove, just above the wrist, was a small, almost insignificant tear. It wasn't a rip, more like a clean incision, barely a centimeter long, as if made by a very sharp blade. It wasn't scorched, wasn't frayed, didn't look like it had been part of the electrical discharge. It was too neat. And it was positioned in a way that seemed deliberate. My internal monologue shifted, a quiet hum of doubt replacing the initial assessment of certainty. If the gloves were designed to protect, and they were mostly intact, how did the current manage such a focused, fatal strike to the chest? And what was that precise cut doing on the back of a protective glove? You see something, Thorne? Harding's voice was laced with the weary expectation of my usual meticulousness. I didn't look up, my fingers gently probing the tear. The gloves, I murmured, more to myself than to him. Heavy insulation. Designed for this kind of work. Right. Fire department said he must have been. Careless, maybe shifted his weight, pushed the cable against himself. Perhaps, I conceded, my gaze moving from the glove to Finch's face, then to the large, complex machinery. The prototype was impressive, a chaotic symphony of wires and circuit boards, but it was pristine, apart from the scorch mark where the cable connected. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned tools, no frantic attempts to pull away. Everything was too orderly. My eyes narrowed. The tear on the glove felt like a misplaced comma in an otherwise perfectly constructed sentence. It shouldn't be there, not in that fashion. An accidental arc would have burned, fused, ripped, but not cut so cleanly. It was a detail that screamed incongruity, a discordant note in the symphony of a tragic accident. My mind, a labyrinth of forensic possibilities, began to spin its threads, weaving a different narrative. The initial tension in the room, born of the tragic discovery, now sharpened into something more acute, a silent challenge to the obvious. This wasn't just an accident. I was almost certain of it. No overt signs of struggle, no obvious defensive wounds. The scene was meticulously staged, or it was precisely what it appeared to be, a tragic accident. I needed more. The details that eluded the initial sweep, the ones that whispered of intent rather than misfortune, would only reveal themselves under a colder, harsher light. The journey to the military medical facility restricted autopsy section was a blur of flashing city lights and the low thrum of the official transport. My mind, however, was already in the sterile confines of the examination room, replaying every angle of the workshop, every glint on the machinery. The air in the vehicle was thick with unspoken questions, but I preferred the silence. It allowed me to construct the initial framework of my hypothesis, even if it was still a skeletal thing, devoid of definitive proof. Upon arrival, the facility's imposing concrete facade loomed under the overcast sky. Security was tight, multiple checkpoints, biometric scans, and a labyrinthine corridor system led to the section I needed. It was an environment designed for discretion, for cases that demanded absolute secrecy. A stoic security officer, whose name I didn't catch, merely gestured me forward after verifying my credentials. The heavy, insulated door hissed open, revealing a pristine, almost unnerving stillness. The room itself was a study in functional minimalism, stainless steel, bright, focused lighting, and an array of specialized instruments laid out with surgical precision. The air, filtered and recycled, carried a faint, clinical scent of disinfectant and something else, something metallic and final. The victim, the tech CEO, lay on the examination table, covered by a sheet. I began my external examination, a methodical sweep from scalp to soul. The CEO was a man in his late 40s, well-maintained, with the faint, telltale signs of long hours spent hunched over screens, a slight forward curve to the shoulders, a subtle tension in the neck muscles. I noted the absence of defensive wounds on his forearms, the lack of shattered fingernails or scrapes that would suggest a struggle. All consistent with an accidental electrocution. Too consistent, perhaps. My fingers traced the precise entry and exit points of the electrical current, as indicated by the initial responders. A small, blackened patch on the palm of his right hand, where he had supposedly gripped the live wire, and a corresponding exit wound on his left foot. Standard. Textbook. But then, I paused. My gloved thumb brushed against a minute indentation on the CEO's inner forearm, just above the wrist. It was barely visible, a pinprick, almost like a healed acne scar, but it was too perfectly round, too precise to be natural. I leaned closer, adjusting the overhead lamp. No redness, no swelling, no immediate reaction. It was almost as if whatever caused it had been there for some time, or had been inflicted with incredible precision and minimal tissue trauma. I documented the mark with high-resolution photography, then proceeded to the internal examination. The standard procedure for electrocution victims involved meticulous inspection of the heart and brain. As expected, there were signs of ventricular fibrillation, the chaotic electrical activity that stops the heart's pumping action. The cardiac muscle showed microscopic damage, a pattern consistent with a powerful electrical surge. The brain, too, presented some signs of electrical injury, but it was the subtle discoloration in the surrounding tissue, a faint, almost imperceptible purplish hue, that snagged my attention. It was not typical for simple electrocution. I took tissue samples, focusing on the area around the pinprick mark and the discolored heart tissue. My internal monologue was a rapid-fire series of questions, each one peeling back a layer of the perceived truth. What could cause such a precise mark? And why the unusual tissue discoloration? I need a full toxicological panel, I instructed the assistant, a quiet, efficient colleague who had been meticulously logging my observations. And a specific analysis for any trace of neurotoxins or fast-acting cardiac agents. Pay particular attention to substances that could mimic electrical shock symptoms. The colleague nodded, already moving to prepare the samples for transport to the analytical laboratory within the facility. My gaze returned to the CEO's chest cavity. The heart, though damaged by the apparent electrocution, didn't quite tell the whole story. The extent of the electrical trauma seemed almost too perfect, a clean, devastating blow that left little room for doubt. But the pinprick, the subtle discoloration. They were anomalies, outliers in a meticulously constructed narrative. I began to hypothesize. What if the electrocution wasn't the primary cause of death, but a secondary event, a cover-up? What if the CEO was incapacitated first, perhaps by a targeted neurotoxin delivered through that tiny puncture, and then the electrocution was staged? The toxin would need to be fast-acting, leaving little trace, and its effects would need to closely mimic the symptoms of electrical shock. A designer poison, perhaps something cutting-edge, developed in the same clandestine circles that might covet the CEO's own technological advancements. This shifted everything. From a tragic accident, the case pivoted sharply into a calculated murder. The implications were immediate and unsettling. This wasn't a crime of passion, but one of precision, requiring specialized knowledge and access. It pointed towards someone with a deep understanding of human physiology, toxicology, and perhaps even the CEO's own work. Someone who could orchestrate a death that would fool all but the most meticulous forensic examination. Someone who understood how to hide a murder in plain sight. The suspect pool, initially broad, now began to narrow. Not just anyone could pull this off. It required a mind capable of intricate planning and execution, someone with a vested interest in the CEO's demise, and the technical or scientific prowess to make it happen. Corporate rivals? Disgruntled former employees with access to specialized research? The tension in the room, previously just the hum of the ventilation system, now felt like a taut wire, vibrating with the weight of a deliberate, unseen hand. I had my anomalies. Now, I needed to connect them. My gaze, magnified by the surgical loops, remained fixed on the CEO's heart. The electrical trauma was undeniable, a scorched path across the ventricular muscle, but the extent of it seemed disproportionate. It was severe, yes, but not entirely consistent with a primary, sudden cardiac arrest from a direct current. There was something else, a subtler damage, a pre-existing vulnerability that the current had merely exploited, amplified, and then obscured. I meticulously excised a small section of myocardial tissue, placing it into a labeled container. Next, I took samples from the surrounding fascia, the blood vessels, even a sliver of the sternum. My colleague, the forensic toxicologist, had already begun initial screenings on the blood and vitreous fluid, but I had a hunch she wouldn't find what I was looking for in the usual places. This killer was precise, almost surgical in their deception. Hours blurred into a single, focused pursuit. I reviewed the microscopic slides, my eyes scanning for cellular anomalies, for patterns that defied the narrative of a simple accident. And then, I saw it. Not in the heart muscle itself, but in the neural pathways surrounding it, a subtle, almost imperceptible disruption. Cellular edema, localized inflammation, consistent with a very specific type of neurotoxin, one designed to interfere with cardiac rhythm. It wouldn't kill outright, not quickly, but it would render the heart susceptible, a fragile target for a subsequent electrical shock. My mind raced, connecting the dots. The faint, almost crystalline residue I'd found on the CEO's workbench, dismissed initially as industrial dust. The specific, non-standard wiring found near the faulty power supply, almost too perfectly positioned to look like a repair gone wrong. The CEO's known habit of working late, alone, focused. The killer hadn't just electrocuted him, they had primed him, setting the stage for the accident. The neurotoxin, delivered subtly, perhaps through a contaminated drink or even a modified air vent system in his private workshop, would have slowly weakened his heart. Then, the staged electrical fault, a final, brutal flourish to erase the primary attack. It was genius in its depravity, a meticulously planned murder designed to look like a tragic mishap. The colleagues' initial analysis had been inconclusive on the residue, too trace to flag immediately. But now, knowing what I was looking for, I knew where to direct her. I called the lead investigator, my voice tight with a suppressed urgency. I need everyone in the briefing room. Now. And I need the head of R&D, the corporate attorney, and the CEO's executive assistant present. An hour later, the small, windowless briefing room within the facility crackled with an uncomfortable silence. The lead investigator sat opposite me, his face grim. Beside him, the three corporate figures, their expressions ranging from weary to guarded. The head of R&D, a man named Henderson, looked particularly ill at ease, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on the polished table. I laid out the evidence, not dramatically. With the cold, irrefutable logic of forensic pathology. The CEO did not die purely from electrocution, I began, my voice steady. He died because his heart was first compromised by a targeted neurotoxin, rendering him vulnerable to a secondary electrical shock that was designed to obscure the initial attack. I displayed enlarged micrographs on the screen, the cellular edema, the specific chemical signature the colleague had now isolated from the trace residue on the workbench, a synthetic compound, highly specialized, designed to disrupt neurotransmitters in a precise manner. This compound, I continued, pointing to the complex molecular structure, is not found in any commercial products. It's cutting edge. It requires specific expertise to synthesize and administer. My gaze swept over the faces in the room, lingering on Henderson. His drumming fingers had stopped. His face was pale. The electrical accident was a diversion, I explained. The faulty wiring, the placement of the tools, all meticulously staged. But the burn patterns on the victim's skin, while consistent with electrocution, also showed a subtle, atypical spread, indicating that the heart was already failing when the current passed through. It was the final blow, not the first. I then presented the second crucial piece of evidence, a microscopic fiber, barely visible to the naked eye, found embedded in the CEO's lab coat. It was a synthetic polymer, unique to a specific type of protective glove used in high-security RAND environments. This fiber, I stated, is not standard issue. It's proprietary. Used only by a handful of individuals with specific access protocols to highly sensitive projects. Projects, I believe, that Mr. Henderson oversees. Henderson shifted, his eyes darting between me and the lead investigator. "This is absurd," he stammered, his voice thin. "I had nothing to do with it. The CEO was a friend." "A friend you were planning to replace?" I countered, my voice sharper now. "A friend whose latest patent, a breakthrough in neural interface technology, you were attempting to usurp for your own gain?" Our investigation into the corporate server log shows a series of encrypted communications, deleted but recoverable, between you and a rival corporation, discussing the CEO's proprietary research. And the timing of these communications ceased abruptly after his accident. The corporate attorney gasped, covering her mouth. The executive assistant stared at Henderson, betrayal etched on her face. Henderson pushed back his chair, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. "You have no proof." "A fiber? A chemical? It's circumstantial." "The proof is in the precision," I corrected, stepping closer to the table. Only someone with intimate knowledge of the CEO's work, his habits, and access to highly specialized chemical agents and materials could have pulled this off. You knew he often worked with advanced circuitry. You knew how to mimic an electrical fault. And you had the means to synthesize the neurotoxin, developed perhaps for a legitimate RAND project, but repurposed for murder. His bravado crumbled. He was going to ruin everything. The confession hung in the air, heavy and final. The lead investigator moved swiftly, placing Henderson under arrest. The pieces, once scattered and disparate, had finally interlocked, revealing the sinister tapestry woven by ambition and deceit. Another story told, another truth unearthed from the quiet language of the deceased.